welcome everyone who's here, 80 of you so far, plus the rest of us. Thank you for joining the launch of the new report, Path to Peace, the case for a peace agreement to end the Korean War. Before we get started though, I bet you there's no one on this call who has not been on a Zoom before, but just in case, we have a few housekeeping things to go over. There is English and Korean interpretation. In the bottom right-hand corner, please click on interpretation and choose the language you prefer. And this is going to be recorded. So if you are worried about being recorded, then please make sure you don't make an oral intervention. Introduce myself. I am Madeleine Rees and I'm the Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And we're one of 3 women's peace organizations that make up the transnational feminist campaign, Korea Peace Now, women mobilizing to end the war. Together with Women Across the DMZ and the Korean Women's Movement for Peace, a coalition of several women's peace organizations in South Korea, the Korea Peace Now campaign advocates for a formal end to the Korean War with a peace agreement and of women's inclusion in that peace process. And there are a lot of criticisms about the naivety of moving towards a peace agreement when there are so many unresolved parts to the complications of achieving peace in the region. But of course, you can't go anywhere without a peace agreement. And so what has happened is the authors have put together a common approach to answering the question, so actually showing how a peace agreement would lead to the ending of the constant state at the moment of a frozen conflict. It would lead to an effective option for achieving the particular goals of denuclearization, improving human rights, and actually moving forward towards a more sustainable system of governance and participation. This report has been done primarily for an audience which is based in DC, but obviously it has advocacy purposes far and wide, because one thing we do actually believe in is the absolute necessity of international solidarity and understanding how peace can and must work. Each speaker will give a brief presentation and then we'll open for Q&A. So if you have questions, do please put them into the box and we will try to make sure we get as many questions as we can dealt with in the very short time that we have. So let me first introduce our speakers. I think those of you who have been engaged in anything to do with Korea and peace will know them immediately, because if passion, commitment, experience and expertise were all that were needed, we'd already be there with the speakers we've got here in terms of finding a peaceful approach. And that's why it's so wonderful to have them in one place to actually explain how this could work. We'll start first with Christine Ahn, who is a friend, brilliant, amazing activist and executive director of the Women Across the DMZ. She'll say why we need a peace-first approach. And then we need to hear from the lawyers, my favorite people, Henri Ferrand, from the Center of International Policy on he'll address the legal aspects of how peace can improve human rights. Then after him, we'll move to Catherine Collot, the advocacy coordinator of Women Across the DMZ. So she'll explain how a peace agreement can help advance denuclearization, which of course is one of the biggest aims that we have within the whole movement. Then Hyun Lee, the US national organizer for the Korea Peace Now campaign, and she'll look at the implications of peace on the US-ROK alliance. And then last but certainly not least, we'll have Youngmi Cho and my dog, sorry Youngmi, she's from the Korean Peace Movement for Peace, and she'll speak to why women must be involved at all levels of the peace process. So can we move first then to Christine to show a video? Thank you and welcome.
The United States and North Korea have remained deadlocked in a 70-year conflict with weapons aimed at each other, ready to be fired at any time. Both Democratic and Republican administrations have tried sanctions, isolation, and military threats to force North Korea to denuclearize. But all of these efforts have failed. Meanwhile, North Korea continues to develop nuclear weapons, and its missiles may now have the capability to strike anywhere on the US mainland. Millions of North Koreans live on the edge. South Koreans must live with the consequences of 30,000 US troops, and tens of thousands of Korean families on the peninsula and in the US remain separated, unable to see their loved ones. And then there are the human costs to this unended war. According to the US Congressional Research Service, if nuclear war were to break out, up to 25 million people would be impacted. Experts and activists increasingly point to the need to officially end the 70-year Korean War. Yet critics insist on the same failed strategy of pressure, isolation, and military threats. Now, a new report, Path to Peace, the Case for a Peace Agreement, addresses some of the common misconceptions and key obstacles for a peace agreement. What it is, who must sign it, and how it can end this decades-long conflict. Most crucially, the report details how a peace agreement is the most realistic and effective solution to cease the dangerous arms race and usher in a new era of peace for millions of Koreans living on the peninsula and for people throughout the region.
What a peace agreement means is that all parties recognize, once and for all, that wartime rights to use force have ended. For the United States, participation is not a question of legal obstacles, but of political will.
Pressure-based denuclearization efforts have clearly failed. A peace agreement would pave the way for denuclearization by directly addressing North Korea's security concerns.
If we're concerned about improving human rights in North Korea, maintaining this ongoing war is not the way to improve them. In fact, the ongoing war is used as an excuse to curtail civil liberties and justify spending on the military, resources that could be used to create genuine human security. A state of peace is far more conducive to promoting human rights than adversarial pressure, which tends to exacerbate the social and economic conditions that strain people's lives.
A peace agreement would also help pave the way for more cooperation between South and North Korea. If the US wants to be a good ally, it should respect South Korea's wishes to pursue inter-Korean peace-building initiatives.
For the peace process to be successful, women must be involved. Women have long called for peace, and they have a considerable stake in its conclusion, given that the unresolved war disproportionately impacts their lives. We must end the Korean War for Koreans, for Americans, for the tens of thousands of Korean families who remain separated. For too many of them, time is running out. An overhaul in US policy towards North Korea is long overdue. The path ahead is clearly before us. Now it's up to us to take that first step towards peace.
Okay, hi everybody. It's so good to see everyone, and thank you for being so patient with my DJing. I want to thank Madeline, and welcome everyone, especially on this occasion when we are grieving the recent murder of 6 Asian women in Atlanta and the rise of anti-Asian violence across the United States. As a feminist peace organization, we see the rise in anti-Asian violence as inexorably tied to not only anti-Asian violence rhetoric that is spread by former President Trump and others, but also part of the long history of violence that is waged through US imperialism in Asia and the Pacific. Today, we bring the focus to Korea, where the US still has 30,000 US troops on 80 bases and has control over the South Korean military in times of war. While the Biden administration has not yet revealed its approach to North Korea, we are already seeing many obstacles to peace. Secretary of State Blinken made remarks in Seoul demanding North Korea's unilateral denuclearization. We've also seen provocative US-South Korea military exercises held earlier this month. And this, of course, prompted warnings from North Korea, and then a counter response from the US Defense Secretary Austin, who reminded that US forces are, quote, ready to fight tonight, end quote. So what we've learned from successive bipartisan administrations is that pressure in the form of sanctions, isolation, and military threats have failed to resolve this conflict. And the stakes, as we saw, are just too high to continue on the same failed path. That's why Korea Peace Now produced the report Path to Peace to assess how a peace-first approach can resolve the security crisis. You can read it on our website, koreapeacenow.org. And we've also produced one-page fact sheets on each of the chapters that you can use to do your education, do your advocacy, doing your organizing. And we will post the link to those fact sheets in the chat. So I'm here to answer the question, why a peace-first approach? Well, we know the Korean War, which killed 4 million people in just 3 years, never officially ended, was only halted by an armistice. That unresolved war has left the Korean Peninsula torn apart, its people divided, and soldiers armed and ready to shoot in the event of any provocation, whether that is accidental or intentional. So put simply, there really is no military option to this conflict or solution. As we know, Secretary of Defense James Mattis had said that a war with North Korea would be catastrophic and the worst kind of fighting in most people's lives. And sanctions have failed to force North Korea to give up its nukes and have major economic consequences for the North Korean people. The only solution is a peace agreement. And this would be a confidence building tool, one that should come at the beginning of talks, not at the end. And we believe this would create the foundation to discuss thorny issues such as arms control and human rights. A peace agreement would improve people's lives through the easing of sanctions and reining in of endless military spending. Sorry, I forgot I had a slide. It would also recognize that once and for all, the wartime right to use force has ended. While policy proposals tend to view a peace agreement as a reward to offer at the end of a denuclearization process, this approach has gotten us nowhere. And in fact, it's been counterproductive because North Korea has repeatedly made clear that they see nuclear weapons as key to their survival. Peace must have no preconditions and be concluded as soon as possible. As Henri noted in the video, it's about political will. And that's what we're trying to do through Korea Peace Now, through webinars like this, and through all of your participation. So the status quo, it just fuels endless military spending and imposes heavy costs on everyone, whether through harsh national security laws or through the diversion of resources to the military instead of investing in things that give us true human security. So the only path forward is de-escalation, and a peace agreement is essential to start this process. So now I'm going to turn it over to Henri, who will give us a little understanding of, what is a peace agreement, all the legal issues surrounding it, and to discuss human rights. So thank you, and Henri.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you all for coming. It's an honor to speak tonight. So I'm going to fill you a little bit in on what the report found on the legal side. The first point that we'd like to make is a peace agreement is the best available legal instrument to start solving the conflict in Korea. There is here, from the war, the problem that it's a key driver of tensions on the Korean Peninsula. And why that is that as long as the war hatchet is not buried, basically, all sides assume the worst and arm accordingly. That's because in international law, while the use of force between states is heavily restricted in peacetime, it is much less so in wartime. So the point of a peace agreement is to return all sides back to a status where using force is heavily restricted. It's a long overdue step, and it need not be complicated. Most typical peace questions, such as borders and prisoners of war, have already been addressed in the armistice. A peace agreement could be concluded tomorrow. Now, a peace agreement is the clearest available expression of the parties' sincerity in resolving the conflict. There is no reason to leave the war going. Delaying an end to the Korean War undermines trust and fuels military tension because, as said, all sides continue to assume the worst. It signals that not all sides are yet ready to lower their weapons. Now, what makes a peace agreement special, what differentiates it from an end of war declaration, from a non-aggression agreement, is that a peace agreement is the only type of legal instrument that ends a war by definition. It's a legal term of art. The others are not. The other instruments, like an end of war declaration, like a non-aggression agreement, or whatever you want to call it, can be a stepping stone, but they can also leave everybody confused because it's as if the hatchet was buried only halfway. You need to bury the hatchet properly if you want to restore trust. You need a binding and final settlement of the war. Now, a peace agreement ending the Korean War must include the United States and both Koreas. It is not legally necessary for a peace agreement to include all sides to a war. It can be politically useful, for instance, to include China, as was suggested in the Panmunjom Declaration. But what is most important is that it must include the parties most at risk of using force, and that is the United States and the two Koreas. The report explains in detail why their participation is not a question of legal obstacles, but of political will, as I was mentioning before. Don't get sidetracked by arguments that the United States fought under the UN flag or that South Korea didn't sign the armistice. Neither of these points prevents them from concluding a peace agreement. And that's a good thing because it means they have an additional tool in their toolbox. Even a bare bones peace agreement is a mutually beneficial, crucially important signal in resolving the security crisis. And the advantage of it, next slide, please. The advantage of it is that peace is also the best way to improve the human rights of all sides. The UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea and Human Rights, Tomás Ojeda Quintana, alluded to the power of peace to improve human rights with the following words: a declaration on peace and development in the Korean Peninsula and a swift resolution of the armistice status would create the atmosphere and space needed for further discussions on denuclearization, less isolation, more access, and respect for human rights. Next slide, please. What's important to understand here is that endless war is a threat to human rights. War is a time of crisis in which governments routinely invoke national security to curtail civil liberties and divert resources towards military spending. That's particularly clear today in North Korea, which systematically points to US hostility as a key challenge and justification for the most visible shortcomings in human rights. I'd like to note at this point that our report had to focus on the North Korean case, but we should not forget how war is also affecting South Korean and American society. For instance, with the South Korean national security law or the massive US military spending on all sorts of endless wars. Now, to come back to North Korea, what we know also is that pressure has not just been ineffective at improving North Korean human rights, it's been counterproductive. There's no evidence that decades, and really decades because it's since the beginning of the war, the decades of military, diplomatic, and economic pressure on North Korea has yielded any improvements in the lives of ordinary North Koreans. On the contrary, it has only isolated them and it has encouraged a mindset of total self-reliance in the leadership, which contributes further to the isolation. It has made it difficult or even impossible to corroborate information about the human rights situation in North Korea. And it has also stifled the buildup of the necessary trust between governments to pursue human rights cooperation. Even if one extends a helping hand in wartime on human rights, it will not be seen as sincere. So what's important to remember here is that no country can dictate to another, you have to do human rights in this way or another. But what we can do is try to do no harm, at least, and try to focus on helping. And what's important here is that the UN General Assembly in 1984 recognized a right to peace. And through that, it was highlighting the link between peace and human rights. And what it was saying is that life without war is the prerequisite for the full implementations of the rights and freedoms of the United Nations. Peace is a prerequisite. Nobody wants to live with wartime restrictions and privations, and especially not if it's a pointless war. Now, peace is the key to effectively improve the lives of the peoples involved in the Korean War. Let's turn the swords to plowshares. It's the right thing to do. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Henri, and good evening to all of you. I have the task of presenting on one of the most talked about issues at the forefront of US North Korea policy, and that is nuclear weapons and the prospects for denuclearization. A question that we always encounter as advocates for ending the war with a peace agreement is what that would mean for North Korea's nuclear weapons program specifically. So while I will address that question directly in terms of the specific legal implications of a peace agreement, I would like to start by first giving a very brief background on the nuclear legacy of the Korean War. And we do this in the report because in order for us to truly resolve the security crisis between our countries, we need to be very clear about what that crisis really is, where it begins, and who is involved in creating this crisis. So next slide, please. Great. So pictured here is the front page of the New York Times on December 1st, 1950. President Truman had just publicly acknowledged during a press conference that there's always been active consideration of the use of atomic weapons in Korea. This is 5 years after the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. We know that nuclear weapons have figured seriously in US military planning throughout the Korean War. And the threat of nuclear war only grew in the years following the signing of the 1953 armistice. The US began introducing tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea in 1958. And for the next 3 decades, the US deployed hundreds more to South Korea, maintaining as many as 950 nuclear warheads in the South at one point. And today, South Korea remains under the nuclear umbrella of the US. I think it's important to highlight this history, not to distract from the current nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula, but to help us understand how the present day crisis, as we know it, is informed by this ongoing war, and even why we are seeing this distinction being made between the US calling for the denuclearization of North Korea versus both North and South Korea calling for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, why that distinction matters. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, this chart shows the estimated nuclear warhead inventories of countries that are both party to and not party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. North Korea has repeatedly stated that its pursuit of nuclear weapons is part of its strategy to deter and contain the US nuclear threat. And this asymmetry of power has long defined US-North Korean relations. It's just looking at this chart, I think it can hardly be denied that the US, which possesses nearly 6,000 nuclear weapons, poses a genuine threat to North Korea today. So if it wasn't already obvious, it's almost certainly unlikely that North Korea will unilaterally, completely denuclearize in the near term. And that's why in the report, we argue that a peace agreement needs to come first to really get at the core of the nuclear dispute. Next slide, please. So for a lot of people, the concept of a peace agreement occurring before North Korea denuclearizes is a difficult one to process. It raises questions. One that we always hear, wouldn't that legitimize North Korea as a nuclear weapons state? Well, here's the thing. North Korea is a country that possesses nuclear weapons. This is a fact that is acknowledged, it's undeniable. In legal terms, North Korea still would not be given the privileges of a recognized nuclear weapons state just for having signed a peace agreement with the US. Not any more than countries like Israel, India, or Pakistan would. And these are all countries that also have nuclear weapons but are not party to the NPT. The simple fact of the matter that we're arguing is that a peace agreement, which would actually allow for US-North Korea relations to transform into one where we can actually engage with one another, not as enemies, but through more normal diplomatic means, that would improve the conditions for us to actually negotiate anything remotely close to a nuclear deal. And that process, that sequencing would be far more conducive to international peace and security than withholding an end to this war in an unlikely bid to disarm one side. Next slide, please. So I'll just conclude here, as I think I've gone a bit over time, but there's this notion that a peace agreement has to, come at the end of a process, that it's the culmination of deals. But in this context, because of the failure to replace the armistice with a binding peace agreement, we believe it's a necessary starting point. That said, there are different arrangements that both sides can take to address denuclearization, as we outline in the report and on this slide. But at a minimum, to truly address the nuclear crisis, we emphasize it requires security commitments on the part of the US. And unfortunately, we've seen administration after administration pursue isolation, sanctions, aggressive military posturing, all of these pressure-based denuclearization efforts that have only come at the cost of a growing risk of nuclear war. So it's clearly time for the US to shift its approach to one of peace. Thank you. I'll pass it over.
Good evening. My name is Hyun Lee, and I'm just going to wait a couple seconds until my video camera comes on. I know it's a lot of talking heads, so maybe we should take a few seconds just to take a breath, stretch, stimulate our brains. I wish I could sing and dance my presentation for you, but I'm not so talented, and I am seeing that we are running behind time, so I will get started. So I am to talk about, another question that we commonly get in Washington when we talk about a peace agreement in Korea is what will happen to the US-ROK alliance after a peace agreement? And I think underlying this question is the fear that a peace agreement would mean the end of the alliance and the assumption that because the alliance should endure forever, we cannot possibly conclude a peace agreement. So I'm sure many of you who have talked to your congressional representatives or people in your administration, you have heard this question. So how should we as peace advocates talk about this issue? So our report presents a two-part answer. So the first is that a peace agreement will not affect the US-ROK alliance because strictly speaking in legal terms, the alliance is a bilateral matter between the US and South Korea. So it's really for the US and South Korea. And if we want to be more accurate, it's the people of US and South Korea who should decide whether they want to continue or discontinue the alliance. So we can say to those people who ask us that question, relax, we can conclude a peace agreement. It doesn't have to be complicated because we don't have to worry about the future of the alliance. Having made that point clear, we also pose the question, should the US-South Korea relationship be a military alliance forever? And we argue that both sides, US and South Korea, have reason to recalibrate their relationship, and that a peace agreement would actually create peaceful conditions that allows both sides to reset their relationship from one that is primarily a military alliance to a new type of partnership that promotes peace on the peninsula and the broader region. And that is actually a good thing for both sides. Next slide. So let's go back to the origin of the alliance. Historically, as you know, it was born out of the armistice situation, which is an unnatural state. The armistice was only meant to be temporary, but what we've had is tens of thousands of troops on both sides in a constant state of readiness for war, going on every day now for 70 years. And this is not a normal situation. Because it's been going on for 70 years, a lot of people just accept it for granted. But we should say this is not normal. All sides are pouring billions of dollars into a perpetual arms race that are about the destruction of the other side. And there's always the threat of war, potentially nuclear war. And this situation has also put a strain on the alliance. For one, there's the ongoing debate on who should pay for US troops in Korea. This will continue to be a source of tension between the two countries. Also, there's the issue of wartime operational control over South Korean forces. So for the US, this means if a war breaks out in Korea, we would automatically be pulled into the war because a US general is in charge of the combined forces. For South Korea, it means it does not have full sovereignty without control of its armed forces. Next slide. So what we're saying is, let's end this abnormal, outdated armistice situation, and replacing the armistice with a peace agreement is the best way to do that. And it would actually benefit both the US and South Korea because it creates peaceful conditions and the two countries can move from a military alliance to a different kind of partnership that is about promoting peace on the peninsula and also the broader region. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to pass it over to Youngmi Cho. Last but not least, she's going to talk about women's participation in the peace process.
Thank you, Hyun, and all. Nice meeting you all. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you. My name is Youngmi Cho, Executive Director of the Korean Women's Movement for Peace, which is the coalition organization founded for women's organizations. I would like to tell you about the women's participation in the peace process. As you know, the women have a particular stake in resolving the Korean War due to the gendered impact of war and militarism. Women have long called for peace, but have been largely excluded from formal peacemaking initiatives. Korean women have faced some of the highest costs of this 70 years conflict. During the war, women were responsible for finding food and shelter. Before the war, until the end of the World War II, Korean women were sexually enslaved by the Japanese Imperial Army. After the war, with the mass stationing of US troops in South Korea, the system of military prostitution established under Japanese rule continued. The South Korean and the US government used women in camp towns to strengthen military alliance and fuel the South Korean economy, yet were stigmatized and silenced. South Korea and North Korea have become highly militarized society, which is correlated with higher gender inequality and greater violence against women. This also redirects resources away from the healthcare, childcare, and other things that disproportionately impact women. In North Korea, widespread sanctions impact women economically, socially, and physically. Sanctions cause delays in the delivery of life-saving humanitarian aid. For decades, women on the peninsula and internationally have mobilized to end the Korean War through grassroots action. Next slide. Several sources of international law, including the Women, Peace and Security Framework and UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, mandate women's inclusion and women's equal participation with men. Research shows that the full, effective, and meaningful participation of women and civil society groups will contribute to a more durable peace. From Liberia to Northern Ireland, Colombia, and the Philippines, the nexus between negotiator and women's peace movements had a positive effect on the peace process, and women have been instrumental in making peace agreements. For the peace process, the Korea peace process to be successful, women must be involved. The Korea Peace Now campaign recommends we urge all parties involved in the peace process to ensure the full, effective, and meaningful participation of women and civil society groups. And we recommend that governments ensure that at least 30% of official negotiating teams are composed of women. Governments should appoint women peace and security ambassadors to anchor and coordinate women's participation. A consultative forum should be established to enable civil society groups to contribute in meaningful ways by engaging in consistent two-way communication with negotiating parties and mediators. We urge all parties to help reduce barriers to women's meaningful participation in the peace process. I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. So Madeline, before I turn it over to you, I'm just going to quickly go over some of the recommendations from the report, and they're all laid out over here, but let me just take this opportunity to convey it. The US, South Korea, and North Korea should immediately conclude a fair and binding peace agreement that acts as a final settlement of the war and serves as a foundation for a peace regime. There should be no political preconditions. We should recognize the end of wartime rights to use force, the armistice, the UN command. All parties should pursue a lasting and stable peace regime and the normalization of diplomatic relations, such as setting up liaison offices, removing the US travel ban on Americans, especially families, from going to see their family. And don't use the peace agreement, don't dangle it as some kind of bargaining chip for subjects beyond the use of force. And all parties should ensure the full, effective, and meaningful participation of women and civil society groups, as Youngmi noted. So that's basically the report. It's a pretty big report, so that's why we have the one-page fact sheets that everybody should use. And we will, in the coming weeks and months, organize a big national advocacy day, because a new House resolution will be introduced, and we're going to need everybody's participation and excitement, because we are in a historic moment. with the Moon Jae-in administration. He is in power for 1 more year. There is a new administration in the White House, and they both control the Congress and the National Assembly. And it is going to be upon us, the people, the grassroots movement, people-powered, women-led, to bring an end to this war. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Madeline, to lead the Q&A. And maybe everybody, all the panelists can turn their screens on so that we could all, and then let me stop sharing.
I was just going to say, actually, Christine, that we should bring that back. So that would be the conclusion. So everybody walks away with thinking, yes, we can. Oh, that was a previous precedent. But it's, but really, that was quite inspirational. We do have some questions in the chat, which I have to now go back and find. The first one, hang on, there was one about American exceptionalism. And how do you think, and I don't know who wants to take this one on, please address the issue of how American exceptionalism, Western superiority, Asian inferiority plays into the US refusal to treat the DPRK as a negotiating equal. Who wants to have a go at that one?
I can start. Hopefully others will add to it. I take issue with this question. Who says Asians are inferior? I don't think so. I know that's not what you meant.
Perceptions.
About American exceptionalism. Yeah. You know, if we look back at the history of negotiations between the US and DPRK, the first major agreement on denuclearization was in 1994, the agreed framework, right? The Geneva Framework. And you know, that agreement was about responsibilities on both sides. North Korea was to freeze its plutonium production, which it did for 8 or 9 years. And the US was supposed to, had also some obligations, build a nuclear light water reactor for energy purposes and deliver crude oil shipments to North Korea. Much later, of course, you know, North Korea actually did meet its end of the bargain. The US did not. Much later, Jeffrey Bader, who was the, I think he was the director of Asian Affairs in Obama's National Security Council. He wrote in his book that the US strategy all along was to delay North Korea's nuclear program as long as possible. And many people in Washington, DC thought that the US did not have to deliver on its side of the agreement because the conventional thinking at that time was that North Korea was going to collapse soon. And so, you know, that is the history. And that is, unfortunately, the history that North Korea has learned in negotiations with the United States. So, yes, I think that, you know, as you say, US exceptionalism does play a role in negotiations with North Korea. But North Korea has also learned from that experience.
Oh, thank you. Great answer. It was really interesting, actually, because just a comment, the American exceptionalism idea based on what? On military prowess abroad. It's so interesting what that exceptionalism actually means. We had another question, which is really on the strategic patience of maybe the Biden administration, which Catherine, can you take on?
Yes, I appreciate how exhausted this person sounds in asking the question, because we would hope that they've had enough of strategic patience. And, you know, I think at least one positive sign we saw early on was that Secretary of State Tony Blinken did acknowledge that past efforts have failed, and hopefully he was including strategic patience in that. It's certainly not something we want to see a return to. It didn't work. And we know that there is an ongoing policy review happening right now. So, you know, we'll wait to find out how much their thinking has shifted, if at all. But I think I just want to also emphasize that what we don't want to see at the same time is a complete dismissal of the better instincts of the Trump administration, which is the direct leader to leader engagement. And we've already unfortunately seen some, you know, very sweeping, you know, dismissals of that approach. We know that that was successful in some way, but it wasn't able to be sustained because of the, well, in practice, maximum pressure was the strategy. But, you know, just I do want to give some, put some optimism out there that, there were some senior officials in Biden's cabinet who have acknowledged the need to avoid repeating the Obama administration's indecision. So I think we'll wait to see whether those lessons learned will factor into the policy review.
Thank you. Thank you. And then there's another question really is for if there were to be a peace agreement, for that to be possible even, wouldn't it be necessary for the US military to leave South Korea? Who wants to take on that one?
What we're saying is there is currently nothing that is in the way of a peace agreement except for political will. That is what our report is saying. The question of the presence of US troops in Korea, that is actually based on a bilateral agreement between the US and South Korea. The Mutual Defense Treaty and the Status of Forces Agreement between those two countries. And so a peace agreement between the US and North Korea, or US, North Korea and South Korea, or US, North Korea, South Korea and China, that does not affect a bilateral agreement between the US and South Korea. So there is nothing barring a peace agreement right now. They can sign it tomorrow if the political will is there. Having said that though, the question of the presence of US troops, that is really a question for us as people in the US and citizens of South Korea to consider. Does it still make sense? We spend $1 trillion every year on military and defense. We need to ask ourselves, does it make us safer? All the crises that we face today, can they be solved militarily? And, peace activists in the US and around the world have been saying, let's shift priorities from war. Let's stop endless wars and let's shift priorities to meet basic human needs. And what we're saying is a peace agreement actually would allow all parties to do that so that we can all, reduce our arms. But that is really up to us as US people in the United States to demand of our government on the question of US troops in Korea.
I wanted to just tag on to that for a second because, so here's a quote from Secretary Blinken in Seoul after his meeting with the president, Moon Jae-in. Quote, "We are committed to the denuclearization of North Korea, reducing the threat that the DPRK poses to the United States and our allies, and improving the lives of all Koreans, including the people of North Korea," end quote. Well, I tweeted, I said, what he should have said is, "We are committed to peace with North Korea, which would eliminate the threat of war and improve American security and those of our allies while improving the lives of all Korean people." And I want to underscore that we have 30,000 US troops still in South Korea. We have, and as we are going through this portal, we are in an anniversary of this pandemic. I often think about Arundhati Roy, who says that as we, this is an opportunity to leave that world behind and begin a new world, free ourselves of the baggage and the trash. And I know it's going to take a lot to do that, but really, this is a moment for us to be redefining what makes us secure. And it's like all the crises that we face, whether it's climate change, the pandemic, racism, misogyny, all those things are not going to be solved militarily. And I just think as we invest in maintaining those bases, as we continue, and I'm saying we from the US, sorry to be so US centric, but this is the biggest obstacle to a peace process is the United States. But if we continue to allow our government to maintain this provocative stance, we continue to do those provocative military exercises, which everybody has said, studies have shown, doesn't deter North Korea, but further incites them. How are we ever going to break free from this constant militarization that we're in? And I just think that, strategic patience, I don't think they have any other, I think that they know that that hasn't worked. They know maximum pressure hasn't worked. Even, Blinken referred to like China, they're going to have to pressure China. Well, they are like ramping up rhetoric against China. They are like I mean, part of this anti-Asian violence is tied to the hawkish rhetoric against China. And so how are you going to convince China to further contain North Korea? I think there's just like, some people are, you know, incredibly delusional in the Biden administration. Unfortunately, they've stacked the State Department and the National Security Council with many of the people from the Obama era. And I just think that we, the people in this country, need to be pushing back. And we have to say, we have to democratize US foreign policy and not just leave it to the military industrial complex, not to the think tanks, not to the quote unquote security experts that have maintained the status quo to continue to go on and on. So anyway, I just wanted to reinforce what Hyun was saying, and what Catherine was saying is, you know, it's going to take us to break this cycle.
I think I can anticipate what's going to be the answers to the other question, and another question that was positive, which is really the role of China as one of the signatories to the armistice. Are there any legitimate interventions, was the question, that they could take that would halt a peace agreement? Do you anticipate there would be obstacles or opposition to a peace agreement from China?
I'm happy to
Who wants to take that one? Okay,
yeah.
Henry.
So China's position on a peace agreement has been actually welcoming. It's taking a position where on the one hand, it adopted sanctions with the United States, but also has insisted that there should be more diplomatic opening on the side of the United States. And we have seen that more clearly in recent months, or starting from about a year ago, where China has been pushing for sanctions relief. Now, the idea that China should be a part of a peace agreement is one that is supported in the Panmunjom Declaration, or at least the possibility of China being a part of it is mentioned. On the other hand, one can note that China has already normalized relations with South Korea and has already normalized relations with the United States. In that sense, it is not a necessary participant from a legal perspective, but it may be one from a political perspective. That depends on what the parties think. And one may, sometimes people assume that North Korea would prefer China to be at the table. But if one looks at the history of negotiations, especially in the nuclear issue, North Korea has not always been open to China being there at the table. It has depended on the situation. It has been open at the time of the six-party talks. But before that, there were four-party talks where North Korea was not so open to it for sovereignty reasons. So it will really depend on what the parties esteem is beneficial to the process. I don't expect China would interfere with the process, however.
Yeah, thank you, Andre. Sorry, I've got dogs barking in the background here. Very practical question from Senator Fedrin of Canada. Are there specific actions that parliamentarians can or should contribute to strategies that have been developed by women peace builders? Hope you got that with the noise in the background.
That's a difficult question for us to answer because I'm not so familiar with Canadian politics, but I can take a stab. I think one is to support the South Korean government's efforts to engage with North Korea, and the inter-Korean joint agreement after the Panmunjom summit did talk about the need to replace the armistice with a peace agreement and formally end the Korean War. And I think it's important for other countries to support this effort. The other thing I want to mention, and this might be a little bit provocative, is the UN command. Our report talks about how formally ending the Korean War actually should lead to the dissolution of the UN command. I won't go into all of the reasons why, because it's technical, historical information that takes time to explain. But I should note that a Canadian general was the deputy commander of the UN command, I think a couple of years ago. And I think we need more efforts by countries, especially countries who were part of the sending countries, that participate in the UN command, to question after 70 years the legitimacy of the continued existence of the UN command.
Thank you. And Canada, as we know, has a feminist foreign policy, so it should absolutely be pushing for a peace treaty first, based on the full participation of women.
Oh, yeah.
Thank
And
you.
Madeline, can I just also chime in? I mean, Jackie O'Neill is the first women peace and security ambassador in Canada. And I think it would be great. It's so great to see you, Senator McFedrin, who has been a real ally to our movement. But it would be great to try to host a briefing for us to give about the Path to Peace report, a feminist approach to all the, foreign ministers, that the women peace and security ambassadors, the gender equality ambassadors. We would love to reach them, and it would be great to have your help to work with Jackie O'Neill to convene such a meeting. And I don't know if Young Mi has something you want to also add.
Yeah, I would like to add something. So President Moon appointed the South Korea's first ambassador of gender equality, whose mandate included the women, peace and security agenda. So I think that Canada and Korea, we can communicate together to develop some of the strategies together. And I also, Canada has many organizations that provide humanitarian aid. So I hope that you will connect with them and make efforts to further North Korea's humanitarian aid policies together. Thank you.
That's brilliant. I hate to say it, but we are 20:59, which means we've got 1 minute. That's all. So I wonder if one of you would just like to make a last ditch pitch to the Biden administration.
Yeah, or maybe just like some quick closing remarks if we have time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, maybe Catherine can go first,
Catherine.
because I think there was a question about the nuclear ban treaty.
There is,
Yeah,
unless we can go over. Can we go over time? I don't know. Can we?
Not too much over.
Why don't I just, I'll try to close and, just shout out to the nuclear ban treaty. One of our recommendations, of course, is for everyone to sign the nuclear ban treaty. The US has been not only resistant, but I think quite obstructive in that effort, which is very telling. There was a question about, the theme of fear that prevents a peace agreement signed. And I love that question. I think that's exactly the issue we're faced with. And I guess my pitch to the Biden administration would be to read our peace report and to end the war and sign a peace agreement. It is the necessary first step. And wow, imagine what that would do for all these other issues that we care so deeply about.
Beautiful. Christine, who would like to jump in next?
I just want to say that timed with Secretary of State Blinken and Defense Austin's trip to Korea, 71 Korean American leaders signed a letter to the Biden administration urging President Biden to end the Korean War, begin by declaring an end to the war and, signal a commitment to begin the process towards the signing of a peace agreement. And, as we think about who is most, what is a feminist approach? It's always about trying to center the voices of those most impacted. And, I'm not, I see there's so many allies with us in this webinar today. And I really, want to center the experiences, especially of Korean Americans who still live with the trauma. I don't know if people have seen the film Minari, which is, now an Oscar nominated film with the first Asian American male actor, Stephen Yeun. In that film, there are characters, there are themes of the unresolved war, from the Korean War veteran that is the crazy cross-bearing American guy, to Harmony, the grandmother who, lost her husband, and that, led to the forced migration of so many Koreans to the United States, but all around the world. And I think President Biden could do what no president has done, and he can help bring closure to America's longest war and help bring healing to so many generations of Koreans on the peninsula and all around the world who still feel the pain of this unsolved conflict.
Beautiful, Christine. Thank you. I think we are actually winding down. There were some really excellent questions in the chat box, which unfortunately we just haven't got the time to get to. But I think between you summed it all up brilliantly in what really needs to have happen. And I don't think Joe Biden was on the participant list, but if he were, I think it would be very fitting to remind him of what his poet laureate, Angela Gorman, said, which is that we go to the past to repair it. And it's almost as if the threats to peace and the planet are so huge right now, as you've all been saying, and that Korea is a symptom of our inability to visualize an alternative. You've seen and shown in the report that you've done, an alternative is possible if we just think of what we need to do to achieve it. So with that, let's take it to the Biden administration, let's take it elsewhere, and let's make this work. And thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you tonight. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, everyone.